Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us again for our grief and praise meditation. I want to thank everyone so far that has joined us in person and online for our Sunday grief classes. I really think that the work that's being done in those groups is incredibly formative for our community. So if you haven't yet had a chance to join us, I invite you to do so. You're completely welcome, either online or in person, whether you've watched any of these meditations or have come to any of the classes before. You're certainly welcome there. I want to briefly recap that the first week of these meditations, we talked a little bit about what grief is, put some definitions on grief. And then the second week, we talked about our first grieving experience as children, that we grieve when we're born. And I asked you to, during that week, talk about your experience with your first loss. In the grief group that week, we talked about mothers, and we talked about what it was like to either lose our mother, or if we were to lose our mother, what that would be like for us. And that conversation was incredibly fruitful, and I'm really glad that people felt comfortable sharing in that moment. And then just this past week, we talked about our first loves and the things and the hobbies and the people that we first fell in love with and what it was like to lose that. And those conversations were also very fruitful and vulnerable for most people, so I appreciate that. This week, we're going to be talking about what is praise. So the book, The Smell of Rain on Dust, takes us on a journey from grief to praise. So if you think about the 5 stages typically of grief and how we go through them all systematically, sometimes we go back and forth. Typically the final stage is something like acceptance. That is to say that acceptance is the way in which we are able to still mourn and be sad about the things that we've lost, but at the same time we have diligently focused on our feelings around that loss. We've taken the time to consider them, to let them flow. Some people think that acceptance means you're over it. I don't really like that phrase of being over something. I really don't think that it's not a challenge that we complete. Rather, grief is an ongoing process that eventually we reach a point of being able to talk about our grief and about our loss openly and honestly, without too much of it rocking our core in that moment. So being able to talk about it in a healthy way. Not that that means talking about it without crying, necessarily, but that we can talk about it without it debilitating us. So this week, I wanted to talk about what is praise. So for the group, if you're coming, I'd like to ask you to consider this one single question, which is, how do you praise God? How do you praise God? Now, for Martin in our book, some of the things he talks about with regard to grief and praise is he says, if we do not grieve what we miss, we are not praising what we love. Let me say that again. If we do not grieve what we miss, we are not praising what we love. I think that's a really beautiful turn of phrase, because it's essentially for me saying that if we're not grieving, if we're not sorrowful, if we're not having some sort of emotional reaction to someone either dying or our loss of something, then we aren't really praising that we ever loved it. Let me give you an example. If you went to a funeral for, let's say, a distant grandmother, a grandmother you really never had any interactions with as a child, maybe she lived far away, or you never got to visit her very much, or maybe you were young when she passed away. If you go to that funeral and in the days and weeks to come, you really aren't at all affected or changed by her not being there, by not smelling her cookies baking in the oven, by someone mentioning her name and you begin to cry. If you don't have any sort of emotional reactions to her loss, to her death, then I would go as far to say that you never really praised or thought about her in a loving way. Maybe you loved her in the sense that we love all of our grandmothers, right? But to truly love someone is to give God praise and give God thanks for that person being in our lives. And so if we're not praising that, if we're not giving God thanks for that blessing, then we're not going to have an emotional reaction when it's taken away or when it's gone. Second, Martin says that real communities are a necessity for people to grieve in a real way. Let me say that again. Real communities are a necessity for people to grieve in a real way. So what I think Martin is saying there is that in order for us to grieve in a real way, meaning a way that's healthy and a way that gets us from sorrow to acceptance, not quickly, but healthily, in a healthy way, that only happens in real communities, not fake communities. So what do I mean by real communities? To me, well, Martin says it right here. In a real community, there are no secrets and there is no shame. That is really powerful and difficult too. That a real community, a community we belong to, a community that would be worse off if it didn't have us in it, that is the definition of belonging, to be missed if you weren't there. In those real communities, there are no secrets and there is no shame. So think about that. What are communities for you that you are in that you feel like you are fully known? That you don't feel ashamed when you cry in front of them? That there isn't some huge part of your life that you're still grieving that these folks don't know about? What communities are you in which people know that your parent attempted suicide or completed suicide? What communities are you in which they know that you were harmed as a child? What communities are you in that know you've had struggles in your marriage? That is what it means to be in a real community. A community that completely accepts you with no shame and knows you fully and wholly. Those are the communities in which you can do some real grieving. Because if you can't be in those communities and be your whole self, your grief is just for show. It's just performative. And he says, Martin says, without these real communities, if you don't have them, you are left alone to swallow your grief and just get on with it. Think about the communities you've been a part of in which you're struggling with your grief in what society has deemed you're taking too long. And you feel like you've had to swallow it, to bury it down deep inside, and to get on with your life. Those are not real communities. A real community, a true community, a community in which you belong, will walk with you in your grief as long as it takes. I want to end with this piece by Martin, who says, grief is not a sickness. Hear that again. Grief is not a sickness, but, he says, it is a pain-filled testament of courageous praise. That is how we get from grief to praise. It is only in those moments when you are crying uncontrollably, wailing over a casket, or just unable to be consoled in grief, in which you are truly praising God for the life, for the meaning of what you have lost. I hope this week you'll consider some of the ways in which you praise God. And I hope that you'll feel comfortable sharing those with our community so that we too can praise God in more than one way. I hope you have a great week. And I hope that you'll join us on Sunday, either in person at St. Peter's or online via Zoom. Thanks.